You have a sense, not an argument, not a conclusion arrived at through reasoning, but a sense that what you most fundamentally are is larger than the life you are managing. That underneath the role and the performance and the carefully maintained version of yourself that moves through the professional and social world, there is something that is not the performance. Something that was present before the performance began and that will be present when it ends. Something that the performance was always, perhaps, trying to point toward, or perhaps trying to conceal. You have no framework for this sense that does not immediately sound either grandiose or vague. The secular world calls it a feeling and does not know what to do with it. The religious world gives it names that carry freight you may or may not be willing to accept. The Upanishads, the ancient philosophical texts composed in the forests and ashrams of India between roughly 800 and 400 BC, are addressed directly to this sense. They were written by people who sat down in the forest, set aside the ritual and the performance and the accumulated social machinery of the civilization they lived in, and asked the question that the performance was preventing them from asking. What am I really? Not what role do I play, not what I believe, not how do I function in the social world. What is this awareness that is aware of all of these things? What is the ground from which the performance arises? What they found, and what they described with extraordinary philosophical precision across more than 200 texts, was Brahman, the ground of all being, the awareness that is not an object of awareness, but the source of it, and the discovery that changed everything, that this ground and the deepest self, Atman, are not two different things. Tat Tvam asi, that thou art. There is a specific kind of philosophical hunger that most people carry in the background of a well-managed life. Not the hunger for meaning in the general sense. The culture has 1,000 products for that. The hunger for the real, the specific, persistent, often inarticulate sense that the life being lived, however successful by available measures, is lived at some distance from whatever is most fundamentally true. That the framework that organizes the ordinary day, the professional identity, the social self, the accumulated story of who you are, is real enough to navigate by, but not deep enough to be satisfied by. The Upanishadic teachers felt this hunger. They were not outsiders to their civilization. They were educated, often of high caste, embedded in the Vedic religious and social world that organized ancient Indian life, and they set it aside, not to reject it, to ask a prior question. Before the ritual, before the doctrine, before the social role, what is actually here? What is the awareness that the ritual is addressing? What is the self that the doctrine is trying to cultivate? Who is doing all of this? What makes the Upanishadic philosophically extraordinary, what distinguishes them from the speculative metaphysics of other traditions, is that the answer is not a belief to be adopted, it is a recognition to be achieved through direct investigation. The Upanishadic method is not argument, it is pointing. The teacher points at the awareness itself, using image and paradox and the specific disorienting quality of language that keeps trying to say what language cannot say, until the student stops looking for the answer and notices what was looking. The Upanishads are a collection of philosophical texts composed over several centuries in India, constituting the final layer of the Vedas, the ancient Hindu scriptures. The word Upanishad means roughly sitting close to, the intimate transmission from teacher to student, sitting beside the teacher in the forest, receiving what could not be broadcast but only shared in proximity with someone ready to receive it.
There are more than 200 Upanishads, of which 10 to 13 are considered principal. The most important are the Brihadaranyaka, the Chandogya, the Taittiriya, the Kena, the Katha, the Isha, and the Mandukya. Each approaches the central inquiry from a different angle, through different images and arguments, often reaching the same destination by routes that look, on the surface, entirely different. The teachers whose names appear in these texts are not the authors in the modern sense. They are the transmitters of an inquiry that was already ancient when they received it. Yajnavalkya, one of the most significant figures in the Brihadaranyaka, is a philosopher of extraordinary depth and memorable personality, willing to argue with kings and his own wives, pressing the inquiry to its most radical conclusions. Uddalaka Aruni teaches his son Shvetaku through a series of demonstrations that build, image by image, toward the great declaration, Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art. You, in your deepest nature, are that, are Brahman, are the ground of all being that you have been seeking outside yourself. The Upanishads were translated into Persian in the 17th century and from Persian into Latin in the 18th by the scholar Abraham Hyacinth Anquetil Duperon. Schopenhauer read them and said they were the most satisfying reading available to him, that they brought him consolation in life and would bring him consolation in death. Emerson read them and absorbed them into the transcendentalism that would shape American intellectual culture. They were the philosophical foundation that the Vedanta tradition would build on, the tradition that Swami Vivekananda brought to the West in 1893, that gave the 20th century a philosophical vocabulary for the kind of non-dual awareness that mystics across traditions had been pointing at for millennia without adequate conceptual tools. The Upanishads gave the inquiry its conceptual tools, and the central tool, the one from which everything else is derived, is the distinction between Brahman and Atman, and the extraordinary claim that the two are one. The philosophy. Precisely. Brahman is the ground of all being, not a god in the anthropomorphic sense, not a creator who stands outside creation, making decisions and receiving worship, the awareness in which everything appears, the consciousness that is not a property of any object, but the condition of all objects, the infinite, self-luminous, self-aware presence that has no beginning and no end because it is the ground in which time appears. The Upanishads approach Brahman through negation, neti, not this, because Brahman cannot be described as an object without reducing it to something less than it is. It is not the sky, it is not awareness of the sky, it is what the awareness is made of. Remove every object of awareness, every content of experience, every quality that can be named and known, and what remains is not nothing. It is the silent, luminous, aware presence that was there before the first object appeared and will be there after the last one disappears. Atman is the deepest self, not the personal self, not the identity, the story, the accumulated history of the person, the witness, the awareness that observes all of this without being changed by it, the thing that knows the dream without being the dream, the silence in which thoughts arise and pass without itself arising or passing. The central Upanishadic claim, the one that Shankara would systematize in the 8th century into Advaita Vedanta, non-dual philosophy, is that Brahman and Atman are identical. The ground of the universe and the deepest self are not two different things. The infinite awareness that constitutes the cosmos and the aware witness that constitutes the innermost self are the same awareness, appearing to be two because of the layer of conditioning and identification that creates the experience of being a separate person in a separate world. Tat Tvam Asi is addressed to this confusion. Thou art that. You, the awareness reading these words, the presence that has been present your whole life without changing, the witness that watches every thought and emotion and circumstance without being moved by them, are not a small, bounded, threatened individual in a large, indifferent universe. You are the awareness in which the universe appears.
This is either the most arrogant or the most humbling thing ever said. The Upanishads say it is the most humbling, because the self it is addressed to is not the personal self that the ego tends. That self is as temporary as everything else. What Tadvam Asi is addressed to is the awareness underneath that self, the witness, the ground,
the one thing that has never changed and will never change, and that was never, despite all evidence to the contrary, a separate, bounded, performance-maintaining self they have been managing. Now, the bridge. Because the Upanishads were composed in ancient India within a specific Vedic and Hindu framework, and most people watching this video are not navigating that framework. But here is what translates without it. The awareness that is reading these words, not the thoughts about these words, the awareness, the presence that has been present your whole life, in childhood, in the crisis, in the ordinary Tuesday, in the grief and the joy, without itself changing. The thing that watched the performance and was never the performance. The silence that was there before the thought arrived and is there after it passes. You do not need the Sanskrit. You need the willingness to look, not at an object, at what is looking. The Upanishadic inquiry is not a doctrine to be believed. It is a direction to look that most people spend their entire lives never taking. And what they find when they look, not with the eyes, not with the thinking mind, but with the awareness that is prior to both, is what the forest teachers were pointing at. Not Brahman as a concept, the direct, immediate, completely available recognition that the awareness in which your experience is happening is not a product of the experience. It is the ground, the space, the silent, luminous presence that has never been born and will never die, because it is not a thing in the world, but the ground in which the world appears. This recognition does not resolve every difficulty. It does not answer every question. But it changes the center of gravity of a life in a way that nothing else quite changes it. Because the person who has recognized, even briefly, even partially, that what they most fundamentally are is not the threatened, bounded, performance-maintaining self they have been managing, but the awareness in which that self appears, is never quite as afraid of losing the self as they were before the recognition. Here is what the Upanishads ask of you, practically, today. First, sit with the question, who is aware? Not what am I aware of, who or what is aware? For 5 minutes, set aside every content of experience, the thoughts, the sensations, the emotions, the plans, and turn the attention toward what is attending, not what you see, what is seeing. Not what you think, what is knowing the thinking. This is the Upanishadic practice of turning the light around, the attention normally directed outward at objects turned toward the source, not to find an object. There is no object to find. What the attention discovers when it turns toward itself is not a thing but a presence, the aware space in which everything appears. This is the beginning of what the forest teachers were pointing at. Second, notice what has not changed. Across the false span of your life, the child you were, the adolescent, the adult in all its phases, what has remained constant? Not the body, which has changed completely, not the beliefs or the personality or the relationships. What has been present through all of it? What has watched all of it without itself being changed by any of it? The Upanishads say this witness, this unchanged, unchanging awareness is what you most fundamentally are, not the contents of your life, the awareness of the contents. Find it, even briefly. Notice the specific quality of it, not its contents, its nature. The silent presence that was there in the earliest memory and is here now and has not, at the level of its pure awareness, aged or changed or become anything other than what it has always been. Third, practice neti-neti with one fixed identity. I am not this body. I am not these thoughts. I am not this role, this story, this set of opinions. Not as denial, the body and thoughts and role are real enough, as the Upanishadic practice of finding what remains when the temporary identifications are set aside.
Take one identity that you are currently most attached to, professional, relational, philosophical, and hold it at arm's length for 5 minutes, not as the thing you are, as the content of the awareness that is more fundamental than any of its contents, something you have, not something you are. What is left when the identity is held that way? What is the awareness in which the identity appears? That remainder, that silent, present, watching awareness is what neti is pointing toward, not nothing, the ground. Fourth, let the recognition inform the performance. The Upanishads do not prescribe withdrawal from the world. The Bhagavad Gita, the text in which Krishna teaches Arjuna from the Upanishadic understanding, prescribes exactly the opposite, full, committed, fearless action in the world, precisely because the person who has recognized that what they most fundamentally are is not the threatened self, has nothing left to defend. The action becomes cleaner, less organized around the maintenance of the performance, more genuinely useful because it is no longer primarily serving the self that is performing. Find one action today that you could take from the ground rather than from the performance, not the action that maintains the image or manages the impression, the action that the situation actually requires from the person who is not primarily afraid of what the action will cost the self, because the self that is most afraid is not the deepest self, and the deepest self, the Upanishads insist, has never been in danger.
I want to close with the image that the Upanishads return to most insistently, the one that appears in different forms across the principal texts, and that is, perhaps, the simplest and truest pointing the tradition produces: the sky and the clouds. The clouds arise in the sky. They have form, color, duration. They move. They produce weather. They are real, and they are not the sky. The sky is the space in which the clouds appear, which accommodates every cloud without being changed by any cloud, which was present before the first cloud and will be present after the last one, which is not the absence of clouds, but the ground that makes the appearance of clouds possible. You are the sky. The thoughts, the emotions, the circumstances, the performance, these are the clouds, real, temporary, genuinely present, and not what you most fundamentally are. The awareness in which they appear is what you are, the space that has been there your whole life, unchanged by anything that appeared in it, untroubled by anything that passed through it, present now as it was present then. Not grand, not elevated, just here. The ordinary, available, completely unglamorous awareness that has been reading these words. And that is, the forest teachers discovered when they sat down and stopped pretending, the same awareness that constitutes the ground of everything. Tat Tvam asi, that thou art, not as aspiration, as recognition. Here is the question the Upanishads leave us with today. Not from the forest, not from the Sanskrit or the tradition or the chain of teachers and students that has carried this inquiry for 3,000 years, from the awareness itself, from what is reading these words right now, before the thought about what is reading arises. What is here? Before the performance begins, before the identity is maintained, before the thought arises and the response is formulated, and the next thing begins. In this silence that is always there underneath the noise of the managed life. What is here? Stay with that for one breath, not to answer it conceptually, to notice what is already present before the answer forms. That noticing is the beginning of the inquiry, and the inquiry the forest teachers sat down to conduct 3,000 years ago is still the most important one available. Leave that in the comments, because naming what you noticed, however imperfectly, however briefly, is the beginning of the recognition that the Upanishads spent 3,000 years pointing toward. The ground that was always here, the awareness that was never absent, the self that was never, despite all the elaborate evidence to the contrary, as small as it feared. I'll see you in the next one.